It started with nothing more than a walk, a quiet, late-afternoon stroll through the west side of downtown Chicago, where office towers cast long shadows over siren-stained pavement, and the early evening air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from the corner vendor. But for Hiroshi Sakamoto, the walk was something more than routine. It was reflection, a rare pause between meetings, and a chance to think without translators or bodyguards or schedules pinned to his wrists like surgical orders. Because he'd come to this country not to be seen, but to observe, to study, to feel the pulse of justice in a system that claimed to be a model for the free world. And yet, within 30 seconds of stepping off the curb onto Jackson Boulevard, he found himself surrounded by 3 squad cars, 8 flashing lights, and 4 white officers whose hands hovered just above their belts, not drawn yet but twitching with readiness, as if his quiet presence in a tailored Navy suit was a threat coded in language they couldn't explain. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," one officer said, voice firm but falsely polite, the kind that made tourists nod and prisoner prepare. "What brings you to this area?" Hiroshi turned calmly. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped?" The officer lied, saying, "You match a description. Asian tall man, dark suit, wandering, suspicious." Hiroshi blinked once, slowly. "Suspicious for walking?" "Sir, step over to the curb." Another officer moved behind him, blocking the path he'd come from. Civilians started to gather, some slow to watch. Others kept walking. One pulled out a phone. "Do you have ID?" one of the officers asked. "Something official?" Hiroshi reached into his inner breast pocket. Not rushed, not slow, just measured, and pulled out a leather wallet the color of midnight. The officers became tense. One reached instinctively for his sidearm, just enough to send a ripple through the air, but Hiroshi didn't flinch. He opened the wallet and held it toward them. Inside was a badge, polished, unmistakable, bearing the emblem of Interpol with a smaller embedded chip that glowed faintly under sunlight, and below it, in fine English text, the words, Deputy Director, Internal Oversight Division, International Criminal Police Organization. The silence that followed could have choked the street. What is this?" One officer spoke mumbledly. "It's a badge," Hiroshi said softly. "And that's my identification. I suggest you verify it." The officer took a step back, glanced at the badge again, then looked to his partner, who had already begun speaking urgently into his radio, his neck turning red. "If you run it through the Department of Justice database, you will find I am here on assignment," Hiroshi continued, "coordinating with federal task forces, reviewing civil rights violations. This street was chosen at random. But now, gentlemen, now it's something else." One by one, the officers' faces shifted, from authority to uncertainty, from suspicion to realization, and finally to fear, not a mistake, but exposure, the kind of mistake that didn't disappear with paperwork or a quiet apology. Within minutes, 2 black Suburbans appeared, their tinted windows rolling down to reveal federal agents in suits who nodded once at Hiroshi, then quickly approached the local officers, voices low and sharp. One agent stated, "You just detained an international director. Do you understand what you've done?" "We didn't know who he was," one cop said weakly. "You didn't ask," the agent snapped. "You assumed, you profiled, and you just triggered an internal investigation that'll reach your department before your shift ends." But Hiroshi remained silent. He stood perfectly still, his badge still in hand, his expression unchanged. Because this wasn't new. This wasn't shocking. It proved my point. It was facts. It was everything he had come to witness with his own eyes, and now, recorded by 5 cell phones, 3 surveillance cameras, and a system about to eat itself from the inside out. Soon after, a reporter arrived. Then another. Soon the scene was on local news. And somewhere inside the federal building, the U.S. Marshal assigned to Hiroshi's diplomatic case filed, dropped his coffee, and whispered, "They did what?" But by then, Hiroshi was already walking again, unbothered, unafraid, his path uninterrupted as the police scattered behind him and the news vans gave chase. Not because he'd yelled, not because he had resisted, but because he had pulled out the one thing none of them expected. The truth, carried not in his voice, but in the calm, devastating authority of a man who had spent his life watching injustice hide in plain sight, and who had finally decided it was time to make it freeze that be why sunrise the next morning. The incident on Jackson Boulevard was no longer a local mistake. It was an international headline, a public relations wildfire, and an unignorable symbol of the very disease Hiroshi Sakamoto had been quietly investigating under the cover of diplomatic anonymity for nearly 16 months. The footage of 4 Chicago officers surrounding a calm Japanese man, their voices taut with false confidence, their postures laced with instinctive suspicion, had been clipped and shared across every platform imaginable, from late-night television monologues to East Asian newsrooms, from law school group chats to civil rights pages now lit with fury and grief and a strange, pulsing pride that someone finally hadn't flinched, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't pleaded or explained or complied beyond what was necessary, but instead had calmly, irrevocably, destroyed their assumptions with the silent flash of authority they never imagined he possessed. United States investigators Interpol Deputy Director Hiroshi Sakamoto, police for walking while Asian, read one headline. The badge that froze a city, read another. And while police unions scrambled to sanitize the narrative, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that officers were following a vague Bola report, no one was listening anymore because the world had already made up its mind, and worse, the U.S. Attorney General's office had been blindsided by the fallout, discovering through furious midnight phone calls that Hiroshi was not only legitimate, but had already submitted 2 preliminary assessments on patterns of racial profiling within urban patrol zones, including Chicago, as part of a cooperative oversight review quietly brokered through the United Nations and ratified without media attention. What had begun as an unassuming audit had now exploded into a diplomatic rupture, and inside the embassy briefing room on K Street, a dozen federal officials sat pale-faced across from Hiroshi as he placed the original report folder on the table without saying a word. We weren't aware you'd already begun fieldwork," one of the officials muttered. Hiroshi gave a slight bow, as if politely acknowledging their incompetence. "I didn't announce it," he replied calmly. "Observation is only valuable when you're not being watched. That is, after all, the nature of profiling. It disappears when people behave." A long silence followed. Deputy Director, another official, said, "Do you intend to pursue charges against the officers?" "No," Hiroshi answered. "I intend to pursue truth. And if that truth has repercussions, then so be it. But I did not come to punish. I came to test." "Test what?" someone asked. "The system," he said. "And you failed." That statement was the first domino. Within 48 hours, Internal Affairs launched a department-wide audit. 2 officers were suspended. Civil rights attorneys from Washington and Los Angeles submitted amicus briefs demanding broader accountability. And behind closed doors, an emergency Senate committee was convened to determine whether the Justice Department had failed to monitor its own foreign law enforcement partnerships. But Hiroshi didn't attend those hearings. He didn't need to. His work was done not in spectacle, but in precision. His badge had already spoken. Instead, he returned to his quiet hotel suite in Washington, D.C., turned on the kettle, and reviewed the next file on his list. Los Angeles, followed by Miami, then New Orleans, each city bearing its own quiet statistics of over-policing and under-accountability, each one now aware that a shadow of oversight had already passed through their streets, watching, recording, analyzing the moments when silence fell, and no one questioned why. However, the impact of that one badge flash persisted even as his work resumed. In Tokyo, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a rare public commendation, calling Hiroshi's composure a national embodiment of integrity. In Seoul, a group of students recreated the Jackson Boulevard encounter in a public performance piece called The Pause. Additionally, the Sakamoto Amendment was drafted in Washington by 3 members of Congress with the intention of strengthening civilian safeguards against undocumented detentions involving foreign nationals. Yet for all the noise, Hiroshi himself remained still, unmoved by fame, unmoved by praise. When a journalist cornered him outside a policy summit and asked, "What would you say to the officers if they apologized to you?" Hiroshi didn't hesitate. "Nothing," he said, "because I was never the one who needed to be heard." The silence afterward was the apology, and the world now owns that silence. That evening, as lights dimmed across the city and the headlines continued to churn, a 12-year-old boy in Chicago watched the video again on his cracked tablet. His father, a warehouse shift worker from Osaka, sat beside him and whispered, "Remember his face, son?" Not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't have to. And across the world, that was the truth now etched into the story. Not that a man had a badge, but that he didn't wield it until forced, and when he did, it broke more than protocol. It broke the illusion that power always wears a face you expect. The storm that followed wasn't born of outrage alone. It was born of ego, bureaucracy, and the instinctive recoil of the system suddenly forced to recognize a mirror it never meant to see, because while the public marveled at the composure Deputy Director Hiroshi Sakamoto and international leaders praised his restraint, inside the machinery of American law enforcement and federal governance, something colder was growing. Resentment, not because Hiroshi had lied or manipulated, but because he had simply shown up, walked their streets, and revealed without fanfare the cracks they had long pretended were cosmetic. By the third week after the Jackson Boulevard incident, murmurs of overreach began to circulate inside high-level DOJ conference calls, whispered accusations that Hiroshi's investigation had been aggressively surveillant, that Interpol should not be operating undercover within sovereign police jurisdictions, even though his mission had been clearly documented, legally sanctioned, and fully transparent to those who bothered to read the diplomatic memoranda. Yet that was the heart of it, wasn't it? They hadn't read. They hadn't cared. And now, their negligence was not only exposed, but embodied a man they couldn't discredit. A man who refused interviews, declined spotlights, and answered every hostile press question with facts, dates, and a silence that landed like a gavel. But the backlash came anyway. One senator went on record questioning whether Hiroshi's presence endangered morale among domestic officers. A police union issued a thinly veiled statement about foreign interference. Even some media outlets began to spin, was the badge a setup? Elite agent or political trap? However, Hiroshi remained steadfast. He was aware of this. In Tokyo, he'd seen it before, systems resisting reform, like organisms rejecting a foreign transplant, spitting out the one thing capable of saving them. And yet it wasn't just his critics who closed in now. Even some allies, unnerved by the sheer magnitude of the ripple effect, began urging him to step back or scale down. Normally composed, the Japanese ambassador to the United States requested a private meeting. "You've made your point," he said gently. "Your silence spoke. Perhaps now is the time to return, before they weaponize your presence." Hiroshi looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't come here to be loud," he said, "but I will not retreat just because they finally heard me." Still, he understood the warning and the danger, so he adjusted. Quietly, strategically, he took a hybrid approach to his investigation, delegating the collection of data to his internal team, only communicating through encrypted channels, and declining all but the most crucial diplomatic meetings. But just as the backlash peaked, something else happened. A second video surfaced. One not filmed by bystanders, but captured from a courthouse surveillance camera weeks before Jackson Boulevard, showing a different man, Asian American, being removed from a courtroom hallway by two officers without explanation, his case paperwork scattered across the floor, his voice calm, confused, ignored. The footage reached Hiroshi's office within 12 hours. It was raw, undeniable, familiar, and though unrelated to his original report, Hiroshi forwarded it directly to the Office of Civil Rights with a one-line note. "How many still haven't pulled their badge?" Within hours, that email, which was leaked by an unidentified employee, went viral. It hit harder than any press conference. It rekindled the flames. And just like that, the tide turned. Under increasing global scrutiny, the Justice Department issued a comprehensive memorandum acknowledging failures in communication and acknowledgement of underlying systemic challenges. The mayor of Chicago publicly apologized. Two of the officers involved in the Jackson Boulevard stop were placed on unpaid leave pending formal review. But still, Hiroshi did not speak. He attended a UN oversight roundtable in Geneva. He reviewed 3 new case files in his Washington office. He walked alone through D.C. alleys without fanfare. He drank green tea in silence at a corner cafe in Chinatown, where the owner left a seat beside him permanently unclaimed out of quiet respect. And he waited, not for vengeance, not for validation, but for the moment when the world would stop asking why he was there and start asking why it took so long for someone like him to be seen. That moment hadn't come yet. However, it was getting closer, and when it arrived, he knew he would still be standing, exactly where they didn't expect him, holding the badge they never imagined he carried, and changing the shape of justice without ever needing to raise his voice. The walls of government don't crumble with explosions. They erode slowly from within, and in the weeks that followed Hiroshi Sakamoto's silent confrontation with American law enforcement, the erosion had become impossible to ignore. Private memos leaked, committee transcripts published, and mid-level officials began resigning under vague health concerns, as the true scale of this audit rippled outward like a shockwave disguised as diplomacy, because what most of Washington hadn't realized was that Hiroshi's presence wasn't accidental. It was surgical, and every street he walked, every courtroom he entered, every arrest report he reviewed had been logged, not only by Interpol, but by civilian rights divisions around the world, all waiting for a single case study, powerful enough to force systemic transparency. And now that case study had a name, a badge, and a face that refused to vanish under pressure. Behind closed doors, attorneys spoke his name with caution, not because he threatened them, but because he had mastered something far more dangerous than noise, precision. Yet while D.C. scrambled to update policy, revise manuals, and commission diversity briefings it didn't fully believe in, Hiroshi remained focused, not on the chaos, but on the patterns beneath it, the mathematical rhythm of neglect disguised as normalcy, because for him, this mission wasn't just political, it was personal. In the quiet of his apartment near the Japanese embassy, Hiroshi opened a locked drawer and removed a single photo worn at the corners, showing a boy no older than 10 clinging to his mother's coat as she stood in the rain outside a U.S. immigration court decades earlier, her posture rigid, her mouth closed, her eyes focused not on the judge behind the glass, but on the officer who had told her, in English she barely understood, that her presence was unnecessary and that she could wait. Outside, that boy had been Hiroshi. That moment had shaped him. And it wasn't the denial or the weight that had burned into his memory. It was the way the officer had looked through his mother, as if she weren't there, as if a quiet woman with dark eyes and pressed sleeves was somehow less deserving of space than the paperwork in his hands. That memory had followed him through every academy, every training seminar, every mission briefing. It was why he never raised his voice. It was why he learned to speak 7 languages fluently. It was why he had entered rooms and let others underestimate him. Because only when people believed you were small did they reveal the size of their failure. And now, decades later, the same eyes that looked through his mother were looking at him. But this time, they couldn't ignore what they saw. Still, power never surrenders quietly. An anonymous op-ed surfaced in a major American news outlet accusing Hiroshi of exploiting diplomatic immunity and suggesting that Interpol had weaponized optics over process. It cited unnamed sources. It raised no real allegations. But it was enough to trigger a low hum of doubt among those already nervous about the foreign badge that had halted one of their own. When asked to respond, Hiroshi said nothing. Instead, he sent a 3-page memorandum to the Department of Justice detailing 12 specific statistical disparities between police conduct involving white men and Asian men in 5 major U.S. cities. Data pulled from their own archives, reviewed, cleaned, and annotated in perfect English, then translated into Japanese, Korean, and Mandarin. He attached no summary, no statement, just a postscript. You asked for substance. Here it is. The memo leaked, and this time, it didn't cause a firestorm. It caused policy. The Senate announced a new bipartisan initiative. Civilian oversight boards expanded their reach. And in Japan, the story of the quiet agent who carried his badge like a scalpel rather than a sword became a symbol not only of justice, but of precision as power. A Tokyo university created a scholarship in his name. A student in Atlanta emailed him to say, "You gave me the words to stay still when they told me to move." But Hiroshi, as always, declined to bask in it. He returned to his files. He reviewed case after case. He held private meetings with victims who had never been heard, professors, or reform attorneys. And though he never sought confrontation, he made one promise to himself that night as he lit a single incense stick for his mother's photo. If they try to erase us again, I will not speak louder. I will simply stay longer. because justice in his eyes was not something earned in outrage. It was something revealed in the seconds when a man shows who he is, without knowing anyone is watching. And now, the world was watching. And Hiroshi Sakamoto, calm, quiet, deliberate, wasn't done yet. The invitation came not with sirens or threats, but with silence. A discreet envelope hand-delivered by a senior liaison from a U.S. Hiroshi Sakamoto, Interpol Deputy Director, Internal Oversight Division, and inside, a time, a location, and a request veiled in formal ambiguity. Confidential briefing, marked the Intelligence Coordination Office without a seal. National implications. Attendance expected. Hiroshi didn't flinch when he read it. He didn't need to. He had known from beginning that this mission would not end in a courtroom or a press release. It would end where power had always tried to hide, behind closed doors with polished tables, control lighting, and voices trained to sound calm while calculating damage. So when he arrived at the unmarked facility in Langley, Virginia, dressed in his tailored black suit with the Interpol badge tucked deep in his coat pocket, he wasn't surprised to find 3 chairs waiting for him. 2 occupied, 1 left empty with surgical intent. Across from him sat a man from the NSA and a woman from a National Security Council, their faces scrubbed of expression, their briefcases locked. Deputy Director Sakamoto, the woman began, "We appreciate your cooperation." "I wasn't given a choice," he replied, folding his hands. "You always have a choice," the man added, "but choices have costs." Hiroshi said nothing. The woman extended her head. "We're here to discuss the broader impact of your recent audit. Not just on law enforcement, but on national perception, foreign relations, and domestic trust." "You mean," Hiroshi corrected, "you're here because truth became visible and your usual containment methods failed." The man flinched slightly but recovered. "Your actions, while technically permitted, have escalated tensions. You've drawn attention to patterns that may undermine public faith in institutions." Hiroshi echoed, "Public faith. Built on ignorance. Maintained by silence. And now you're angry that silence is no longer an asset." The woman exhaled. "We're asking you to consider the broader implications of your work. Global law enforcement collaboration, intelligence sharing, civil stability." Hiroshi nodded slowly. "You wanted to stop, to close the file, to walk away quietly so your structure can patch its cracks and continue to rot in private." The room went still. "Let me offer you something," the man said. "We'll recommend you for an interagency command role, advisory, permanent. You'll have global access, quiet influence, a seat at the real table." Hiroshi blinked once. "You think I care about the table?" "We think you care about results." "I do," Hiroshi said. "And that's why I won't take the seat. Because seats come with handcuffs. And I've spent my entire life making sure my hands stay free." The woman tried again, softer. "If you don't cooperate, others will decide how this ends." "They already did," he replied, "on Jackson Boulevard." The room held its breath. "I didn't expose your system. Your system exposed itself. All I did was stand still long enough for people to see it." The man looked tired now, less angry, more trapped. "You're not the first," he said. "Others have tried." Hiroshi nodded. "But I'm the first who didn't raise my voice. And somehow, that was louder than anything you planned for." He got up. "You have my reports, my documentation, my recommendations. I will submit no further edits. The world is watching, and I trust they'll make their own decisions now." He turned toward the door, then paused. "One last thing," he said. "You're afraid of disruption, but you should be more afraid of preservation, because a system that must be hidden to survive is already dead." And with that, he walked out, past the guards, past the glass, past the institution that still hadn't decided whether it feared him more for what he said or for how calmly he said it. That night, the government issued no statement. The White House remained silent. But change was already moving, quietly, steadily, in the form of city council votes, amended training protocols, and young officers rereading their codes of conduct with unease in their eyes. And somewhere in Tokyo, a former diplomat smiled at the headline in her tea-splashed newspaper and whispered, "He didn't burn the system. He exposed it to sunlight. And for Hiroshi, sunlight had always been enough. When Hiroshi Sakamoto stepped off the plane at Haneda Airport, the sky over Tokyo was low and gray, the kind of soft, overcast morning that seemed built for reflection, not ceremony. And true to form, there were no red carpets, no press, no speeches waiting for him. Only the hush of sliding doors, the polite distance of security staff who recognized him but said nothing, and the quiet wind off the bay that moved the hem of his coat like a whisper. But what Hiroshi didn't expect, what gave him pause for the first time in weeks, was the way the customs officer looked at his passport, then up at him, eyes wide with something deeper than respect. Understanding. "Welcome home, Sakamoto-sama," the officer said, and there was something in his voice, steady, reverent, that told Hiroshi the man had seen the footage, read the reports, heard the silence, and now carried the weight of what it meant. Hiroshi nodded, collected his things, and walked to the terminal, each step heavy not with exhaustion, but with gravity, the kind of stillness that arrives only after a storm you didn't choose to fight, but refused to run from. Outside, a black sedan waited, but he didn't enter it right away. He paused at the arrival's terminal and looked around, not for surveillance, not for danger, but for something else entirely. And then he saw her, a young girl, maybe 17, standing by the rail with a notebook in her hand and tears brimming in her eyes. She approached him slowly. "Excuse me, She stopped, swallowed. "I just wanted to thank you for not shouting, for not backing down." She held out the notebook. "Thanks to you, I want to study law. I want to protect people in the same way that you did, without fear and calm." Hiroshi accepted the notebook. Inside, she had clipped a printout of the photo from Jackson Boulevard. Him holding his badge, the officer mid-step, the bystanders watching. She had written 5 black words beneath it. "This is how you fight." Hiroshi closed the book gently, handed it back, and said, "Then fight with your mind, not your fists. And when they ask you to move, remember, your silence can speak louder than their orders." She bowed deeply. He bowed in return. Then he entered the car, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to close his eyes, not in sleep but in peace, because the mission had never been about punishment or reform or fame. It had always been about recognition, about reclaiming a presence that had been dismissed for generations, about drawing a line in the quiet and saying, "We exist. We remember you. We are not moving." As the city unfolded beyond the window, Hiroshi thought of the millions who had watched the video, not because it was dramatic, but because it was still, because it showed that justice could be quiet and still be unstoppable. He had also demonstrated that dignity did not necessitate shouting in a society obsessed with noise. It only needed to remain. The world had frozen when he pulled his badge, not because of the badge itself, but because for once they had to reckon with the fact that the man holding it wasn't who they expected. And now, the world would not forget him. Not the badge, not the silence, not the stillness. Because Hiroshi Sakamoto hadn't walked into a broken system to fix it. He had stood inside it long enough for everyone else to see what it really was. And in that seeing, everything had already begun to change.